A widow, a child, and a drifter tied together by dust, debt, and the kind of silence that only the Wild West understands. 5 months without rain, one barn reduced to ash, a man with nothing to his name but an old saddle and a past he won't talk about. Why did Clara Whitmore, tough, quiet, and still wearing mourning black, let a stranger stay on her broken land? And what made that man, Colt Decker, risk everything for a widow who swore she needed no saving? In a town where rumors travel faster than horses, and love rarely lasts longer than a drought, one whisper might change everything. But can two souls, haunted by fire and betrayal, rebuild something real, or will the West swallow them whole like it's done to so many before? If stories of resilience, quiet love, and second chances stir something in you, then stay close. Hit that like button, share this tale with someone who believes in redemption, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Now Saddle Up. This story begins where most love stories would end. The dust hadn't just settled on the land, it had settled in her bones. 5 months without rain, 5 months without peace. The Colorado sun had long since turned kind fields into cracked clay, and even the crows had grown tired of circling. For Clara Whitmore, every morning began with silence, and every night ended with something that felt heavier than exhaustion. Her tracts of land, once lined with bright-eyed mustangs and summer green grasses, now stretched dull and brittle to the distant hills. Willow Ridge, the name her late husband had painted on the sign at the front gate, had become a place more of memory than of life. Clara moved through her days like a ghost, efficient, quiet, focused. She woke before the sun and split kindling with hands that no longer trembled. She patched the barn roof by herself last month, balanced on weak rafters, because there was no one else to ask. The neighbors didn't visit anymore, not since she turned down Jed Hornbeck's offer, the one that came too soon, with eyes that didn't mourn and promises that felt more like possession than kindness. There was no one but Rose now, 7 years old and full of questions. The girl had her father's gentleness. Clara often thought, same shy smile, same way of listening, as if the world might whisper something important at any moment. She brushed Rose's hair each night beside the fire, humming songs her mother once sang, and hoped her daughter wouldn't remember the trembling in her voice when the wind blew too hard against the shutters. Clara's husband, Daniel, had died in the spring. A landslide took him during his last desperate attempt to tap water from a dry creek bed 5 miles east. It hadn't been heroism, it had been necessity. The cattle needed water. The family needed something more than prayer. And so, he went alone. When they found him, his body was buried beneath broken rocks and a collapsed willow. That tree used to bloom white every April. Now, its splinters lined her memories. She never remarried. Not for lack of opportunity, Jed had made sure she knew there was room for her in his house. But Clara didn't need safety born of submission. She needed a reason to believe again, and nothing about Jed's offer looked like belief. Now, each day bled into the next. Mornings were chores. Afternoons were quiet conversations with Rose and long, thoughtful stares at ledgers that never balanced. Evenings were filled with patching saddle straps and sewing the same dress Rose had outgrown, again and again. She wore black still. 1 year, to the day, next month. Folks in Silver Hollow had already started whispering, said it wasn't healthy, said she was keeping the child too close to grief. But grief, Clara thought, didn't live in the dress. It lived in the spaces Daniel used to fill, his chair, his boots. His laugh, faint in memory. She'd tried asking the bank for an extension on the loan. Mr. Haskett had smiled with all his teeth and offered a suggestion. Instead, sell the land, marry Jed, move into town. It'd be easier on you and the girl, he'd said. Clara had simply thanked him and walked out, head held high, palms sweaty beneath her gloves. That afternoon, she fixed the fence line herself. The wood was warped, the nails rusted. Each slam of the hammer was a prayer not for strength, but for endurance. As the sun lowered one late afternoon, Clara sat by the edge of the creek that used to snake gently through her property. Now it was a bed of stones, bleached and silent. She watched Rose play in the dirt nearby, building towers out of twigs and pebbles. The child hummed softly, unaware that her mother's mind was elsewhere, somewhere between memory and desperation. The wind picked up. It carried heat and the faint scent of ash from distant brush fires. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, even though the air was warm. She pressed her hands into the dry earth beside her and let herself breathe slowly. No words, no plans, just breath. And then she saw him. At first, it was just a dark shape on the horizon, wavering with the heat. A rider. His horse moved unevenly, as if favoring one leg. Dust clouded behind them, a slow approach rather than a gallop. He was coming from the south, from the edge of nothing. Clara squinted into the sun. Her heart didn't race. It rarely did anymore. But her hands tensed just slightly as she stood. Rose noticed and stood too, inching behind her mother's long skirt. The man drew nearer, his figure more defined now. He sat tall but slouched forward with weariness. His coat was torn at the shoulder, one boot dusty and cracked. The horse was a sorrel, limping with a wrapped leg. Clara took one step toward the house, her eyes never leaving the stranger. She didn't speak, didn't call out. Just moved, measured and calm, toward the porch, where a long unfired rifle leaned against the doorframe. Her fingers curled gently around the wood, not in fear, but readiness. The stranger didn't raise a hand, didn't shout a greeting. He simply stopped about 30 yards from the fence line and remained in the saddle, silent, as if waiting for permission to breathe. The wind whistled low between them, and in that moment, Clara Whitmore stood alone on the ridge, her black dress clinging to her calves. Eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a borrowed hat, and waited. He looked like he carried the West on his shoulders, and he wore silence like a second skin. The man stayed mounted, his horse trembling beneath him, one leg favoring the other. The creature's flank rose and fell unevenly, its hide dark with sweat and dust. Clara kept one hand resting on the rifle, but didn't lift it. Something about the man's posture, neither threatening nor desperate, kept her rooted. He finally dismounted, slow and stiff, like every movement cost more than he could spare. His coat was torn down the back, one boot worn near through, the brim of his hat drooping with weight and weather. He didn't step past the fence line, just removed his hat and nodded once. Clara didn't answer. He glanced toward the barn, then at the limp in his horse's gait, and finally met Clara's eyes again. He spoke with a voice like dry gravel. Just need the use of your farrier's stand. Mare threw her shoe 15 miles back. His words were plain, but his eyes said more. Exhaustion, pride, maybe something older than both. Clara didn't speak. Instead, she looked toward Rose, who peeked around the porch post. The child clutched a tin cup in her small hands, half full of well water. Before Clara could stop her, Rose stepped off the porch and offered the cup toward the man. She's thirsty too, the girl whispered. The stranger hesitated, then knelt and offered the water to the horse first. The mare drank slow, each swallow heavy in the silence. Only after did he sip the remainder himself, nodding to the girl. Thank you kindly. Clara watched all this with a mix of tension and confusion. Still, she gestured toward the barn with a tilt of her head. You can use the tools. Don't break anything. She didn't wait for an answer, just turned back inside, the screen door clicking shut behind her. That evening, Clara didn't sleep deeply. Wind whistled down from the hills, rattling loose shutters and carrying dust into the corners of the kitchen. She lit a small lantern and moved to the front window. Out past the porch, the barn sat quiet, except it wasn't. Through the cracked wood slats, she saw the faint glow of a lantern. The man was inside, kneeling beside his horse. His coat was off, sleeves rolled, hands steady as he wrapped a new dressing over the mare's swollen leg. He moved with care, murmuring something low, one hand stroking the animal's muzzle. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he took off his own jacket and draped it over the mare's shivering body. Clara's breath caught, not because he was kind, kindness could be feigned, but because he did it with no audience, no eyes to impress, no one to convince. She turned away before he looked up. Morning came in hues of burnt gold. The wind had left behind branches across the yard and a thin film of grit over the windows. Clara stepped onto the porch to fetch water and paused. He was still there. The horse stood steadier now, tied loosely near the corral. The stranger knelt, adjusting the shoe with deliberate, practiced ease. Her tools had been cleaned. Even the worn rasp had been oiled. He didn't look up when he spoke. "She'll walk easier now. Thank you for the use." He brushed the dust from his hands and moved toward the saddle. Something in Clara wavered. "You patch your own tack too?" she asked, more sharply than she meant. He stopped. "When I have tack to patch." She nodded once and turned away again. The way one turns from a truth too large to name. By noon, the stranger was gone. The barn stood still. The tools were exactly where she'd left them, but better. Organized, sharpened. The floor swept. Clara stood in the doorway longer than she intended. The afternoon passed quietly. Rose painted with crushed berries on the porch. Clara repaired a torn cinch strap. The house creaked in the heat. And then, just before supper, a noise returned from the road. Hoofbeats. The mare limped back into view, slower this time. Colt Decker. She had heard the name when he'd spoken it at the fence, dismounted without a word. He didn't ask, didn't knock. He simply walked to the barn, inspected a corner post, and began hammering. Clara watched from the porch, mouth half open. He'd come back, not to ask, but to fix something that wasn't his. "Wind did a number on the northwest post," he said over his shoulder. "Didn't notice it till I was riding out." She wanted to ask why, but instead, she handed him a wedge of bread and a half jar of apple preserves when he paused. He nodded once and kept working. That evening, after Rose had gone to sleep and the dishes were stacked, Clara stood at the door again. Colt sat on a stump near the barn, whittling the end of a spare fence rail. The wind had died. The world felt still in a way it hadn't for months. "You can stay," she said quietly. He looked up. "Just for the night," she added. "Storm's coming in." He didn't smile, didn't say thank you. He simply nodded once and resumed his carving. In towns like Silver Hollow, silence was never golden. It was just the space between gossip. Clara felt it first in the way heads turned just a little too slowly when she walked into the feed store. The smiles that used to greet her were replaced with nods tight, polite, and measured. People who used to ask about Rose now asked only about the weather. Colt had been at Willow Ridge for 6 days. In that time, he'd repaired the broken hinge on the barn door, mended 3 fence lines, and built a cradle out of spare planks for a lamb that Rose had found limping along the ridge. He didn't ask questions. He didn't overstep. But he stayed. And Clara didn't ask him to leave. They worked well together. Too well, perhaps. Each morning, Clara found coffee already made, her tools already sharpened. When she went to feed the hens, the coop had been patched without her asking. When she lifted heavy sacks of grain, his shadow would appear beside her, offering silent help. Rose had taken to him too quickly. If Clara was honest with herself, she called him Uncle Colt without hesitation, skipping behind him in the yard, asking questions he always answered softly, his voice lower than most men, edged with something old and careful. Clara would catch herself watching them sometimes. The way he knelt when speaking to Rose. The way he never touched her without reason, not even a hand on the head. Not even when she hugged his leg. He respected a child's space in a way few grown men did. That, too, unsettled Clara because it meant he knew something of being hurt. The whispers in town soon found their way to the church steps. The Ladies' Aid Society, always warm to Clara since Daniel's death, suddenly forgot to bring her preserves this week. She wasn't invited to Mrs. Harlow's luncheon. Sister May turned her eyes away when Clara approached the pews on Sunday. She didn't need words to know what was being said. A widow, a stranger, a man sleeping in the barn. It wasn't just her reputation on the line, it was her daughter's future. And Silver Hollow never forgot what it decided was a woman's sin. Still, Clara said nothing. She focused on the chores, on Rose, On the way, the trampled soil began to settle under new hooves, on how Colt spoke with the horses like they were old friends. Then Jed Hornbeck came riding up the path, boots polished and hat tilted just so, as if the dust didn't dare touch him. Clara saw him before Rose did and told her to go inside. Colt, shirtless from hammering up new siding, stepped back into the barn quietly. Jed dismounted like a man who expected the world to wait while he straightened his cuffs. "Clara," he said, too warmly. "Didn't think I'd need an appointment to speak with an old friend." She didn't answer. "I hear you got company these days. Man from nowhere, bad leg, bad luck, bad idea." He smiled, but there was no mirth behind it. "Folks are talking. You know how that can ruin a woman's name faster than the fire ruins a barn." Clara folded her arms. "Is that what you came to say?" "No," he said, smile fading. "I came to remind you that a woman alone doesn't stay afloat long out here. Banks don't forget, and fences don't fix themselves forever." She waited. "You still have time to sell. Move in with me. Rose gets schooling. You get security. Ain't no shame in choosing shelter over pride." Clara stepped forward, face unreadable. "Shelter's not what I need, and neither is a cage." Jed's expression changed just enough for the edge to show. "Suit yourself. Just don't say you weren't warned when Willow Ridge folds under its own weight." He tipped his hat and turned, boots clicking sharp on the porch wood. As he rode off, his back stiffened like a man unused to hearing no. The next day, Clara went into town for supplies. At the general store, Mr. Cargill folded his hands and cleared his throat when she asked for the usual credit extension. "Miss Whitmore," he said, eyes darting to the window. "I've always admired your independence, but these are uncertain times. Unsettled company. Can't extend credit until your note is cleared." The line behind her was quiet. Clara's cheeks flamed, but she didn't argue. She gathered what little she could pay for, turned, and walked out with her chin high. Colt was waiting at the wagon. He said nothing as she climbed up, her hands shaking slightly. He didn't speak as they rode back, but when they arrived at the barn, she found a small sack of flour, a roll of twine, and a fresh packet of coffee beans on the workbench. She turned to him, jaw clenched. "You had no right." His voice was calm. "You didn't ask for it, didn't need to. I don't want your charity," she said, voice low, trembling at the edges. He nodded. "And I'm not offering it, just paying back the shelter." That night, Clara sat by the fire, Rose asleep on the rug nearby, and watched the flames. Colt stood outside, repairing a broken latch by lamplight. After a long pause, she opened the door and called out softly. He came in slow, removed his hat, and sat across from her without speaking. They stayed in silence a while. It wasn't uncomfortable, just full. Finally, Clara spoke. "You don't talk much." "I used to," he said. "Talk too much to the wrong people." She waited. "I owned land once," he said finally. 500 acres near Abilene. Cattle, fence, house with a green porch swing. "What happened?" she asked. "My brother happened." She looked at him. "I left him in charge while I went south to negotiate a rail contract. Came back to find everything gone. Sold under my name, deeds forged, bank cleaned me out. Wife left the next week, said I'd gambled it all away. I hadn't." His eyes didn't water, his voice didn't crack, but something in his shoulders broke. "I wandered after that," he added. "Figured there was nothing left that needed my hands." Clara stared into the fire, her own pain suddenly less isolated. She poured him a cup of coffee, her hands steady now. He accepted it with a nod. Outside, the wind shifted. Colt stood to leave, but paused at the door. "I'll stay through the end of the week, at least till the west side of the barn is braced." Clara didn't say no. It wasn't thunder, but something in the air snapped like a warning. The wind had started just after noon, a high, keening whistle that rushed down from the hills, curling through fence posts and rattling the loose boards on the barn. Clara was hauling hay from the back field when it hit hardest. A sudden burst that flung open the gate and sent the dried bundles tumbling like tumbleweeds on fire. She ran. Rose called after her, but Clara shouted for the child to stay inside. The hay storage shed barely holding together for weeks gave out first. Its roof lifted like a paper hat and slammed into the corral fence with a crack that silenced even the chickens. The rear wall collapsed in on itself, sending dried feed and splinters into a chaotic heap. Inside, one of the older mares slipped in the panic. Clara watched it fall, legs crumpling hard, chest heaving in panic. The other horses reared and kicked, pressing toward the far corner. Colt arrived at a run, his breath sharp, shirt stuck to his back with sweat. He didn't ask what happened, didn't waste time. The mare wheezed and trembled on the ground, her eyes wide with pain. Clara pushed past him, rifle in hand. Her steps were firm, lips tight. "She's done," she said, voice flat, no use dragging it out. Colt stepped between her and the horse. No force, just presence. "Give me an hour," he said. "If I can't get her standing, I won't stop you." Clara hesitated, shoulders stiff. She'd seen too many animals suffer too long. But something in Colt's expression wasn't pleading, it was determined. She lowered the gun. He disappeared into the barn and returned with a pouch she hadn't seen before. From it, he pulled dried roots, bark, and something that smelled sharp like mint, but earthier. He chewed a few, crushed the rest with a flat rock, and mixed them into a poultice. Clara stood back, arms crossed, watching the process like a test she hadn't agreed to. He applied the mixture along the mare's legs, whispering something low she couldn't hear. After a while, he placed a warm cloth over the horse's neck and poured water slowly over her lips. The wind began to die as suddenly as it came. An hour later, the mare shifted, not much, just a twitch of the hind legs, then a slow, cautious roll. Colt stayed at her side, murmuring the whole time, hands ready but gentle. Clara dropped to her knees, more from exhaustion than awe. The mare struggled, then stood, wobbly, alive, and Clara, overcome, collapsed forward, her arms gave out. Darkness didn't come like sleep, but like surrender. She woke on her own cot. Light from the window told her it was nearly morning. Her body ached in strange places. Her hands were wrapped in cloth. Her boots had been removed. A blanket covered her chest, and her damp hair had been combed back. A basin of water sat near the chair, where Colt now sat, head bowed, elbows on knees, watching her. He didn't speak, neither did she. He stood after a moment, slow and quiet, and stepped outside. She listened to his footsteps cross the porch, then fade into the early light. Later that morning, Rose entered with a bowl of warm porridge and a shy smile. Uncle Colt said not to move fast. She chirped, "He fixed your hands. You burned 'em on the fence post. You were carrying too much at once." Clara didn't answer, but her throat ached not from smoke, but something harder to swallow. She rose slowly that afternoon, walking through the house as if seeing it new. The kitchen seemed quieter, the windows cleaner. There was a stillness, not emptiness, but calm. By supper time, she found herself watching Colt from the back doorway. He was splitting kindling, shirt damp with sweat again, hair pushed back with a handkerchief. Rose sat nearby, counting firewood pieces like a game. Dinner had already been simmering. She didn't remember starting it. And then, almost without thinking, she set 3 places at the table. When Colt came in, he hesitated at the threshold. She didn't speak, just nodded to the chair nearest the window. He looked to Rose, who beamed. Clara ladled stew into the bowls. The silence wasn't heavy. It was quiet, like a song they all knew the tune to, but weren't ready to sing aloud. They ate slowly. Afterward, Rose asked if they could say grace together. Clara, startled, nodded. Rose closed her eyes, hands clasped. "Thank you for the food, and the horses, and the people who keep them safe. Amen." Colt's eyes stayed closed a moment longer than the others. Later that night, Clara stood by the doorway again, watching Colt fix the latch to the chicken coop. He caught her eye, just briefly, and for the first time, she didn't see a stranger. Love didn't arrive with trumpets, it slipped in like smoke, unnoticed until you couldn't breathe without it. Clara hadn't meant to knit the sweater. It started with a few stitches to mend an old hole in Rose's scarf. Then, without thinking, Her fingers kept moving quiet, measured, rhythmic. She unraveled a wool shawl she no longer wore and began weaving something new. Each evening, after the supper dishes were dried and Rose was tucked beneath her quilts, Clara would sit by the fire and let her hands do the remembering. Colt didn't know. Not until the night she tossed the half-finished bundle onto his bunk in the barn. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, and something else she didn't name. "For the mornings," she said, turning before he could answer. That night, the wind softened, the air tasted like the start of winter, but inside the house, warmth held steady. Colt joined her by the hearth after Rose had fallen asleep. He didn't sit close just enough to share the firelight. They didn't speak at first. The silence between them had become a kind of language. Finally, he spoke. "She died in the spring," he said. "Emma." Fever came fast, like a storm that didn't wait for the gate to open. Clara listened. "I was 2 towns over, chasing a shipment I never got paid for. By the time I got back, they'd already buried her. Told me she asked for me near the end. I wasn't there to hear it." He stared into the flames. "I still hear it anyway." Clara didn't offer comfort, didn't say the usual things. She knew better. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a smooth river stone, the one Daniel had once given her on their 2nd anniversary. "He died digging for water," she said, voice like smoke. "Said the land would break before he did." The fire crackled. He was wrong. She didn't cry often. But that night, with the fire low and the house too quiet, the tears came without asking. Colt didn't move to touch her, but she felt his presence steady beside her, like the quiet strength of a barn beam in a storm. When she wiped her face, she noticed he hadn't looked away. Later, she found herself lying in bed, wide awake, thinking not of Daniel, but of Colt's hands, the way they cupped the steaming mug of coffee, the way he spoke about loss like a man digging gently through broken earth. She didn't name the feeling, not yet. The morning came wrapped in frost. Clara rose early, stirred the fire, and stepped out onto the porch with a bucket in hand. The horses stirred in the paddock. Smoke drifted faint from the barn's chimney. Then she smelled it. Not smoke from firewood, but something harsher. Burning hay. Clara dropped the bucket. The first flames she saw licked up from the east wall of the barn. They were too high, too fast, not accidental. "Rose," she shouted, running back into the house. The child was already by the door, rubbing her eyes. Colt came flying from the barn's far side, coat thrown on, boots untied, horses. Clara gasped, "We have to." But he caught her, arms firm around her shoulders, holding her back as the fire roared higher. "You can't," he said low. "It's too late. I can't lose them. I won't lose you too." "Behind them!" Rose screamed as one of the mares bolted from the barn, smoke trailing from its mane. The structure collapsed inward with a sound like thunder timbers groaning, walls splitting, sparks shooting into the gray sky. Colt pulled Clara and Rose away, shielding them with his coat as debris flew. They stood on the hill, barefoot in the dirt, watching it burn. The horses that escaped ran wild across the fields, silhouettes against the rising smoke. Clara couldn't speak. Her chest ached with the weight of it. Hours passed in a blur of ash and panic. The fire eventually smothered itself in the dirt. Nothing was left of the barn but a black skeleton. Colt never left her side. When the last ember dimmed, he crouched to examine the edges of the blaze, his face shifted eyes narrowing. Clara followed his gaze. Near the rear fence line, beneath a charred board, was a broken lantern, and near it, boot prints, deep, heavy, fresh. She didn't need to ask whose they were. Jed. She looked to the ridge just as a lone figure on horseback appeared. Jed Hornbeck. He didn't approach, didn't wave, just watched, then turned his horse and rode away without a word. Colt stood slowly, his fists clenched, but Clara stood straighter than she had in weeks. She didn't cry, not this time. Sometimes the fire that burns down a barn isn't the most dangerous. It's the fire it lights in a man's pride. The morning after the blaze, Clara's boots crunched over ash and splintered beams. Smoke still curled from the blackened earth, clinging to the corners of what once held life. She didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The air smelled like loss. Rose lay inside, fevered and quiet. She'd inhaled too much smoke during the chaos, and now her breath came in shallow gasps, her cheeks flushed with heat. Clara sat at her bedside for hours, pressing cool cloths to her brow, whispering songs with cracked lips. The horses that had survived wandered the far pasture, eyes wild, legs bruised. One had a deep gash near the flank. Clara stitched it herself, fingers shaking, thread biting into her raw palms. No neighbors came, not even to look, but the voices still found her. Some say she did it herself. Mrs. Harlow whispered too loudly at the general store. Barn was old. Insurance would cover a new one. She was always proud. Another added, too proud. But desperate women do desperate things. No one defended her. Even the banker, Mr. Haskett, shifted his eyes away when she asked for grace on her loan. He cleared his throat and handed her a folded notice. "We'll need a formal investigation before further arrangements can be discussed," he muttered, eyes fixed on the ink bottle. Then Jed Hornbeck returned this time with papers. He came on horseback, dressed in his Sunday best, posture straight as his lies. "You've trespassed long enough. Clara," he said as he handed her the envelope, "this land's never been properly deeded. Your husband's name was never on the county books. I've got the surveyor's mark and 3 witnesses saying this was Hornbeck land back when your daddy was still carving fence posts." Clara's fingers curled around the paper. She didn't tremble. "Not outside." "You're lying." Jed smiled. "Let the court decide." When he left, Colt found her sitting on the porch steps, the envelope unopened beside her. "I know a map," he said. "Drawn by my father when he worked the East Ridge, same boundaries as yours. He kept copies. If we find it, it could prove your deed's real." Clara didn't answer. "Let me ride south," Colt added. "I know who might still have it." She looked at him, then really looked. His face, roughened by sun and time, held concern that was too heavy to carry. It reminded her of the weight she'd carried alone for so long. "I don't need your help," she said, the words coming sharp, like brittle glass. He stiffened. "This isn't about charity." "Yes, it is," she snapped. "It always is. First the feed, then the barn repairs. Now, a miracle map. What happens when I lose anyway? You'll stand over me with that same look, that same pity." Colt stepped back like she'd struck him. "I'm not offering pity." "Then what are you offering?" she said, voice rising. "Because I don't know how to carry someone else's broken pieces while mine are still scattered." The silence after felt heavier than fire. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat at the window long after the lamps were out, watching the empty fields where the barn used to stand. Rose coughed in her sleep. The wind picked up. In the quiet, she knew she'd pushed too hard, but she also knew the words had been true. By dawn, Colt was gone. His bunk in the barn, what was left of it, was empty. His saddlebag missing. His coat, the one she had knitted into, folded on the porch rail. At first, she thought he'd gone for the map. Then she found the letter. It was wedged between the doorframe and the woodpile, scrawled on the back of a feed invoice. Her name, written with care. "Clara, you don't owe me anything, and I'm not leaving because of your words. I've said worse to myself more times than I can count. But the truth is, you're still standing, even after everything. And me, I'm still trying to decide if I'm a man who builds or one who just passes through the ruins. You can win this. I believe that. But you don't need a man who's still carrying the weight of his own fire. So I'll ride south, find what I can. If I don't come back, it's not because I stopped caring. It's because you deserve more than a man who keeps looking backward." Colt. She read the letter beside the remains of the barn, the wind tugging gently at the corners. When her tears fell, they didn't burn. They softened the ash, one drop at a time. In the West, the truth is often buried just below the surface beneath boots, bones, and bitterness. Clara heard the creak of saddle leather before she saw him. It had been 5 days since Colt left. 5 mornings waking to silence. 5 nights wondering whether she'd been too proud or just too scared. He rode in slow, hat pulled low, his face unreadable. Behind him, tied tightly to the saddle, was a worn leather satchel with an iron clasp and a government seal half faded by time. He didn't speak when he dismounted. He didn't ask to come inside. Clara met him halfway between the ash heap and the porch, her hands stiff at her sides. He held out the satchel. Inside was a rolled parchment wrapped in oilcloth, the seal of the Territorial Land Commission still intact. "I found it," he said, "filed under the wrong family name, probably on purpose." He paused. "But it's yours." "It always was." She stared at the parcel for a long time before taking it. Their hands didn't touch. "Thank you," she said, barely audible. He nodded, then turned and walked to the edge of the porch, dropped his bedroll beside the steps, and sat down without a word. That night, Colt didn't ask to come in, and Clara didn't invite him. But she watched from the window as he took off his boots, folded his coat beneath his head, and lay beneath the stars like a man who didn't believe he'd earned the warmth inside. She cried quietly at the kitchen table because she didn't know how to say, "I'm sorry," without making it worse. And because part of her wasn't sure she deserved the map, or the man who brought it back. The next morning, the courthouse hall was thick with dust and heat. Townsfolk filled every creaking bench and leaned against every wall. Even those who claimed not to care came because out west, nothing draws a crowd like the chance to see a woman fall. Jed Hornbeck stood near the front, flanked by a lawyer in a crisp black coat and a smirk carved into his face like it had been put there with a chisel. Clara sat alone at the petitioner's table. Her hands were clean, her dress plain. Rose stayed home, watched over by Miss Melba from the schoolhouse. The judge entered, an old man with a gray beard and eyes too tired to play favorites. The questioning began slow property lines, inheritance documents, the lack of a clear deed under her husband's name. Jed's lawyer made each missing paper sound like a sin. Then came the questions she hadn't expected. "You've had a man living at your property since July." Clara didn't flinch. "He worked on the barn. I let him stay in the shed. Uncompensated, unpaid." "Yes." "Did he sleep in your home?" "Only once, after the fire." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "And this was after you received the insurance claim for the barn." "I haven't received anything. The claim's still under review." "But you filed one." "I had to," she said, voice hardening. "We lost everything." The lawyer turned to the jury. "Interesting timing. Wouldn't you say?" Murmurs spread through the room. Clara's spine stiffened. She looked toward the benches, but no one met her eyes, not even the women from church. She reached into her bag, pulled out the parchment Colt had returned, and laid it gently before the judge. "This map," she said, "was drawn by Thomas Decker, land surveyor for the Northern Pacific Line in 1866. It shows clear boundary lines for the parcel my husband and I homesteaded. It's notarized. And matches the topography exactly." The judge opened the scroll. It crackled with age, but the lines were still legible. Jed's lawyer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "That map's out of date. It hasn't been validated in decades." Before the judge could reply, a cough rose from the back of the room. An old man stood slowly, his frame bent, eyes milky but clear enough to find his way forward. "Excuse me, Your Honor?" The judge blinked. "Mr. Prentice?" The man nodded. "I worked with Tom Decker, hauled his gear across half this territory before rail hit dry ground. I saw him draw that map. I carried it myself to the post office. That land belonged to Whitmore. I'd stake my last tooth on it." Silence fell. Even Jed's smirk faltered. The judge looked down at the map again, then back to the room. "We'll adjourn for the afternoon," he said slowly. "I'll need to verify this record with Territorial Archives. Court resumes tomorrow." Clara stood on uncertain legs, the room swirling with heat and tension. As she stepped outside, the crowd parted just enough for her to pass through, but not enough to make her feel seen. Colt waited across the street, leaning on the hitching post, watching. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but he tipped his hat, and for the first time in weeks, Clara tipped hers back. Justice doesn't always ride in on horseback, but sometimes it still arrives right on time. The town hall smelled of dust and old ink when the judge returned. Afternoon light streamed through high windows, cutting pale lines across the benches and faces. Clara sat straight-backed at the petitioner's table, palms flat, breathing slow. Colt stood behind her, hands clasped behind his back, a quiet shadow she could feel without looking. Jed Hornbeck lounged beside his lawyer, boots crossed, one hand on the edge of his hat like he was just waiting for the curtain to drop. The judge adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and unfolded the verified map with deliberate care. This court, he began, finds the 1866 map filed under the Decker Survey valid, verified by both the territorial archives and first-hand witness testimony. A breath caught in Clara's throat. The court recognizes the Whitmore claim to the land as lawful and continuous. The judge continued, all challenges to said ownership are hereby dismissed. A pause. Mr. Hornbeck's claims are denied. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, a single pair of hands began clapping slow, uncertain. It was Miss Melba from the schoolhouse. Then a few more joined. Someone whistled. Another called out. About time, but most just sat still, their gazes lowered, faces flushed. The kind of silence that doesn't celebrate it, regrets. Clara didn't smile. She didn't stand. She just exhaled. Jed didn't clap. He stood instead, stiff and red-faced. The room watched him shift, saw the fury building behind his jaw. Then his hand moved toward his coat fast, too fast. Colt stepped forward before anyone else even blinked, not running, not shouting, just walking straight into Jed's path like a man who had nothing to prove. "Don't," Colt said softly, his voice like iron smoothed by time. "There's a girl back home who still believes men can be good." Jed froze, the butt of the revolver still visible but untouched. The town marshal, quick now, stepped between them, hand firm on Jed's shoulder. "Enough," he barked. "Jed Hornbeck, by order of the mayor, you're being held pending investigation into multiple land filings, including this one." Jed's jaw twitched, but he didn't fight, not with the room watching, not with Colt standing that still. He walked out in cuffs. As the hall cleared, Clara remained seated. Her hands trembled now, not from fear, but from the kind of relief that hurts just as much as dread. She turned, meaning to say something to Colt, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't ask for them. That night, Willow Ridge was quiet again. The wind had calmed. The stars hung lower somehow. Clara stood by the window long after Rose had gone to bed. She still couldn't sleep, still couldn't breathe steady. Then she heard the softest of footsteps. Rose. The girl walked in barefoot, eyes wide with mischief and meaning. She held something wrapped in linen. "I found it in Mama's sewing box," she whispered. "It was Grandma's." She unwrapped the bundle. A thin silver ring, simple and dulled with age, sat in her small palm. "Mama won't say it," Rose added, "but she wants you to stay." Clara's heart cracked in two. Colt had stepped onto the porch just then, leaning against the railing, his back to the house, staring out at what was left of the barn, maybe just the open sky. Clara walked out, barefoot like her daughter. She held the ring in her hand. He turned when he heard the door. Their eyes met in silence. She stepped closer, pressed the ring into his palm without a word. Colt stared down at it, then up at her. No questions, no grand speeches, just breath shared between them in the cool of night. He went down on one knee, not for show, not for tradition, but because sometimes the only way to say "I see you" is to kneel before the thing that made you believe again. Clara's hands found his shoulders. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. Later, she stood in his arms beneath the stars, her cheek against his chest, his hand wrapped firm around hers. She cried not from grief, not from fear, but because she had forgotten what it felt like to be chosen gently. In that quiet space between ash and tomorrow, they made no vows out loud, but everything between them already knew. Some folks rebuild barns, others rebuild souls. The ash was long swept away by then. carried off by rain, wind, and the passage of kind hands. What remained wasn't just scorched earth, it was foundation. Colt's hammer echoed across the field as morning light spilled over the ridge. Clara stood nearby, marking timber lengths, while Rose handed up nails from a small bucket, like it was the most important job in the world. The new barn wasn't fancy. No ornament, no stained glass window like the church, just beams, boards, and a roof that could hold through wind. It was enough, and they weren't building it alone. Old Man Prentice brought over leftover shingles from his own shed, even though he walked with a cane now. The preacher's wife dropped off sourdough bread with a note, "I was wrong. This is me trying to be right." Even Jed's cousin, a quiet man no one much heard from, showed up with a coil of rope and a pair of leather reins. Clara accepted each offering with a nod and a quiet, "Thank you." Nothing more. She didn't need grand apologies. She just needed space to move forward. Rose had drawn a picture the day before. It was simple three figures standing in front of a red barn, smiling. The woman had long brown hair. The man wore a wide hat. Between them, a little girl held both their hands. She tacked it above the stove with a bent horseshoe nail. "Now it's our kitchen," she declared. Colt said nothing, but his eyes lingered on that drawing every time he passed it. They fell into rhythm, the way farmers and families do. Clara managed the books, the feed, and the routines. Colt took the horses, the fence lines, and the maintenance. Rose took to chasing chickens and pretending she was the boss of both. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Colt came in from the field and washed his hands in the basin. Clara handed him the ledger, opened to a page that had been blank just the week before. "Read it," she said. He did. His name, Colt Decker, written neatly next to hers on the official land entry. 2 signatures, 2 owners. "You're not just staying," she said quietly. "You're part of this." He didn't answer right away, just closed the book, his thumb brushing over the spine like it was something sacred. Then, gently, he kissed her forehead. The wedding was set for a Sunday. Nothing grand, just Pastor Elias, Miss Melba, Prentice, and the butcher's wife. Rose insisted on wearing boots with her dress, and Clara let her. They baked their own pie, hung wildflowers over the fence. No music, no fanfare, just hands held in honesty and vows said soft, but sure. A few days later, a letter arrived. Stiff paper, northern postage. Colt read it twice, standing at the edge of the porch. "My brother wants us to visit," he said at last. "Montana. Says there's room on the ranch. Could be good for Rose. Big skies, fresh start." Clara took the envelope, ran her thumb along the edge. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked out toward the paddock, where Rose was racing a young colt across the field, laughter bright against the fading light. "We've just started here," Clara said. Colt nodded slowly, folding the letter once more. No decision was made that night, but none needed to be, because sometimes rebuilding isn't about leaving scorched ground behind. It's about staying and growing roots where the fire once was. The West teaches you to speak with your hands, your heart, and sometimes just a whisper. It wasn't a grand wedding. Clara didn't want one. She wore her mother's old dress, once yellowed with time, now carefully mended and pressed until the fabric flowed like memory. A faded blue sash around her waist, added by Rose, made it feel like something new. Colt shaved that morning, the first time in years. His jaw felt raw, unfamiliar. He wore a white shirt he'd kept folded in the bottom of his satchel since his mother's funeral. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The sleeves were too short, the collar too tight, but Clara smiled when she saw him. So, he wore it proud. The wedding took place under a string of lanterns draped across the back fence. The sun hung low, staining the sky with soft fire. Pastor Elias read the vows from a leather-bound book older than anyone present. His voice was warm, cracked, and slow, like water finding its way down stone. Miss Melba brought a basket of wildflowers. Prentice sat near the front, cane in hand, boots polished. The butcher's wife made a pie so sweet it stuck to the roof of every mouth. And Rose barefoot, hair in braids, freckles blooming under the last light, stood between Clara and Colt with a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," she announced. Everyone hushed. She cleared her throat, then read, carefully, "Families aren't made just by names. They're made when someone stays. I didn't ask for a new daddy, but God gave us one anyway. And now, when I draw pictures, there's 3 of us each time. That means we're a family, not just yours or mine." She looked up, grinning, then paused. "I love you both." That's when the tears came. Clara's hand reached for Colt's, fingers tightening like roots finding soil. Colt knelt to hug Rose, resting his forehead against hers. The applause was soft, nothing loud, just hands pressed together in shared quiet. After the pie, the sun dipped below the ridge, and guests wandered home in pairs. Lanterns stayed lit, crickets began their songs. Clara, Colt, and Rose sat near the fire pit. Someone had brought extra wood. The flames crackled gently. Rose curled up in Clara's lap at first, then climbed between them and promptly fell asleep with a sigh. Colt tossed another log into the fire. Sparks rose like stars with no sky. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, her dress crinkling with the movement. They didn't speak. The fire spoke for them. So did the scent of baked earth, the rustle of the trees, and the gentle weight of the child they both now called ours. For a long while, the only sound was the wind. Then Colt leaned in, his breath brushing against Clara's ear, and whispered, "I'd trade 10 herds for one night, just like this." Clara didn't move. She opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze steady in the flickering firelight. Then, slowly, she nodded. No words, no need. They sat like that for what felt like hours, watching the fire fade, the sky darken, the night settle around them like a blanket pulled by familiar hands. Eventually, Colt lifted Rose gently and carried her inside. Clara followed, barefoot, the hem of her dress trailing through the dust. Inside, the house was quiet, lived in, whole. He laid Rose in her bed, brushing hair from her forehead. Clara stood in the doorway, arms folded gently across her chest, watching. Later, they stood on the porch together, the last lantern swaying in the breeze. Beyond the fields, the rebuilt barn stood in silhouette, a little crooked, a little rough, but standing all the same, like them. Colt reached for Clara's hand. She didn't hesitate. They held on not because they feared letting go, but because they didn't need to anymore. The stars blinked above, distant and eternal. The wind curled through the grass, whispering stories older than their names, and somewhere between the flicker of flame and the breath of night, a love born in ash, rebuilt by hands and silence, settled into the earth, soft, certain, true. In the dust and quiet of the West, what survives isn't strength, it's tenderness. This story is a quiet reminder that healing rarely comes in grand gestures. Sometimes, it arrives through silent help in the barn, a child's drawing hung on a kitchen wall, or a man choosing to stay when it would have been easier to leave. We learn that love doesn't shout, it whispers. And sometimes, the most courageous thing isn't fighting, but believing again, trusting again, letting someone hold your broken parts without asking them to fix it. For anyone who has lost, who has built a life from scraps, or who thought their second chance was long gone, this story says, it's never too late. The land may be dry, the heart may be tired, but hope finds its way, if you leave the door open. So, wherever you are in your life, whether rebuilding, remembering, or simply holding on, know this: a whisper of kindness, offered quietly and without condition, can change everything. Even out here, where the winds carry more grief than rain, love still grows. Thank you for riding with us through every dust storm, quiet glance, and whispered promise. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Wild West Echoes. Your support helps these forgotten voices find their way home again. Until next time, keep the fire warm and the stories alive.